Pine.
Welcome. YouTube's been having some troubles today, I think. So I had to do from schedule to a live now. But I think it's working now. Okay, so who gets 1,000 Pine Points today? It is Eric S. Nice. 1,000 Pine Points for you. Welcome. What is the 1042 apologetic? Well, it's an apologetic, and basically, I want to do this stream for Christians. You atheists, you folk, you can still listen to me and hang out here. But the goal here is for Christians to outsmart your fellow Christians. So when you're a Christian person and you hear another Christian say, "Oh, there's more evidence for Jesus than X," and fill in the X with your favorite ancient person, you can say, "No, that's not true." And then when they look it up later, they can say, "Oh, wow, you're right." So this is a way for some Christians to look really smart. So the 1042 apologetic is that there's 42 ancient sources that record Jesus within 150 years, within his lifetime, so 30 AD and 150 years about after that, whereas there's only 10 sources for the contemporary Roman Emperor Tiberius, who lived or died around the same time as Jesus. So this should be impressive, right? If this is true, that if you look at from the time of Jesus' death compared to Tiberius' death and go 150 years from that point, and you compare what we have, the sources for Jesus to this famous Emperor Tiberius, it's 42 for Jesus, 10 for Tiberius. The problem is, it's not true. Now, where did this come from? This came from this guy, a Dr. Michael Licona. I think it's probably him and a guy named Gary Habermas, which I'm going to show a couple of videos from soon. And Michael Licona says, the Roman Emperor Tiberius was a contemporary of Jesus. The number of non-Christian sources who mention Tiberius within 150 years of his life is equal to the number of non-Christian sources who mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. If we add Christian sources, the Jesus-Tiberius ratio goes from 9 to 9 to at least 42 to 10. In addition, the purpose of writing heavily influences what authors do and do not write about, and they write according to where their interests lead them. Christian writers said very little about the Roman lords, and the Romans said very little about Christians. Moreover, if the early church believed that Jesus' eschatological return was imminent, that Jesus would return, we might expect a lack of motivation at that time for writing more on his historical life. So what's Michael Licona saying at the end here? He's saying that a lot of early Christians truly believed that Jesus was going to return soon. So why bother even writing about it? And so maybe that's why the amount of sources that we have for Jesus is low. But I just thought of this a few minutes ago when I was going over this stuff. And you know how Christians, apologists, and pastors, they often say that the writings for Jesus are early? And, some say 40, 50 AD, just 10 years, 20 years after Jesus' death. And then you have Paul. If this is true, what Michael Licona is saying, that if they believe that Jesus' eschatological return was imminent, we might expect a lack of motivation at that time for writing more in his historical life. Why on earth would they write anything in the 10, 20 years during their lifetime about Jesus if they were expecting his return? I think Michael Licona is right here. I think this is what Michael Licona is saying here is pretty good evidence that the Gospels were written late, when they started to realize, oh, maybe Jesus isn't coming back in our lifetime. Maybe we should start writing some of this stuff down. Okay, I want to focus on a guy named Gary Habermas, and I don't know what I should play first. I'm going to go in chronological order. This is from Biola University, September 14th, 2013. And this is him talking about this apologetic, this 1042 apologetic, although he doesn't call it that at this point. So take a listen to what he says.
Better data and closer to Jesus' time. Okay, how about Tiberius Caesar? He is the Caesar who's on the throne.
Octavian is that smart young guy that Julius Caesar, the Julius Caesar, really loved and bequeathed everything he had to him. But he wasn't his blood relative, I don't think, at least maybe not close blood relative. So we got a guy named Octavian, and Octavian had a daughter, and I think Tiberius married his daughter, and so he became, Octavian married Tiberius's mom, and so Tiberius's stepdad was Octavian. I think that's right. So basically, there's a lot of incestuous relationships back then. But basically, that's a relationship between Julius Caesar to Octavian to a guy named Tiberius.
We have 4 major sources for Tiberius and a total of about 10 sources for Tiberius. We have more than 10 sources for Jesus, and you go, yeah, but that's those prejudiced New Testament sources. Okay, more about that in a second. Used the way critics use, we still have more than 10 sources for Jesus. Do you know we have 12.5 sources outside the New Testament for Jesus? 12.5 sources outside the New Testament that are within 100 to 150 years after Jesus, which is fair in the ancient world. And now when I say 100 to 150, you realize that John's a lot closer than this. But back to Tiberius. We have 4 sources for Tiberius. One is
Okay, I'm just going to say at this point, he's right. There is 4 sources for Tiberius, but there's a lot more. It's one of those like how many women were at the tomb thing. Habermas is not saying that there's only 4, but he's just saying that there's 4, but there's actually a lot more.
Temporary. You go, whoa, we don't have anything like that for Jesus. But as I'm going to argue tonight, we do. We have sources, I'm going to spend the rest of my time explaining, that go all the way back to 30 AD.
So he just said that there's contemporary sources for Tiberius, which is true, but he's saying now that we also have it for Jesus, which is false. You are wrong, Habermas.
For Jesus. Okay, so next best source. By the way, the earliest one for Tiberius, the historian who gives the contemporary data, he's the least useful. The least useful of the four sources. The best source for Tiberius is Tacitus. And Tacitus, if that's Tiberius down there, ground zero, Tacitus, we'd probably be 2/3 of the way up the pews here. Because Tacitus writes, sorry, that's the last guy. Tacitus is going to, if that's John, Tacitus is going to be about here. Tacitus writes about 120 AD. He's plus 80 after Tiberius. Suetonius, plus 85. And Dio-Cassius, 2/3 of the way up or further. Dio-Cassius is plus 180 from Tiberius. Go, well, okay, I see where you're going, but I have the ultimate objection for you.
Okay, so for the people from Alabama, what is he talking about here? He's basically saying that here we got this great Roman leader named Tiberius, and the evidence for Tiberius is actually not that great. It's pretty scant. And when you compare it to Jesus, they're about equal. In fact, if you add Christian sources for Jesus, Jesus kicks butt. It's like 42, the ratio is 42 to 10. Now, but the problem with this is Mr. Gary Habermas is wrong. He's incorrect. And he has a pattern of of this. And I want to bring up something that I did a while back. And this is, for most of you, you don't care about this, but in the history world, in the ancient history world, this was a big deal. And the deal was, there was a rumor going around. No, it wasn't just a rumor. There was people saying, and Gary Habermas was one of them, that we had in our possession a document of Mark, a fragment of Mark, that is dated into the 1st century, which is a huge deal because the earliest before then was in the 2nd century, and it wasn't of Mark, it was of John, I believe. And so here we have this fragment of the first gospel dated to the 1st century. Now, everybody got excited, and however, the problem with this is it wasn't true. It ended up being dated somewhere in the mid-2nd century, or maybe even later, I forget. And so all this hype of this 1st century fragment, which would push the dating of the Gospels even earlier, was incorrect. But here is my clip of Habermas that I did on this 1st century Mark debacle. And take a listen how confident. Now, looking at this point, a lot of other apologists and historians were kind of backing off and hedging their bets that maybe this isn't a 1st century, but not Gary Habermas. And to this date, he has not apologized for this, whereas other pastors, apologists, and historians have apologized, like Daniel Wallace.
Okay, but one paleographer, I don't even think he's a Christian, but you have to be very specialized to be able to date ancient writings by handwriting analysis, by the type of handwriting. And a date was just given. I asked permission. Could this date be given? I was told it could be.
He was asked permission. Who did you ask, and who gave you permission?
And the date of this little papyrus from Mark is 80 to 110 AD.
So this is February 23rd, 2018, and he's still, Josh McDowell, and seems like he's hedging his bets a little bit, but Gary Habermas is very confident here that that he has it on good authority that there's a manuscript existing that's dated between what did he say, 80 and 110, something like that. And we know now, looking back, he was wrong. He is giving confidence to the students listening to him right now that on things that are untrue.
It is earlier than writings for John. So, if the fragment for Mark is about the time of John or earlier, now critics are saying we're going to have to move the Gospel of Mark back to 40 or 50 AD.
We're going to have to move the Gospel of Mark back to 40, 50 AD. Why is this such a big deal for these guys? Because they realize that if the Gospels are dated late, then basically the game's over. It's basically anybody who could have said anything against the historical data of Jesus is dead. They're just gone. And so if the earlier you can get it towards Jesus' life, the more gravitas they have behind this. But the point of me showing this video is that Habermas has a history of, do I say exaggerating? No, that's the wrong word. Of just building up confidence on things that he either knows is false or he's just too anxious. No, he's too excited. He's too, here's the word. He's too desirous for this stuff to be true that he'll say things to people who look up to him and say, look, you're a historian. We will just listen to what you have to say. And yet he's flat out wrong about this stuff. Okay. So now I'm going to bring in Kamil, it's his birthday today. So happy birthday, Kamil. And you're still on mute. Let me get you guys set up. And Cam, who is not wearing the man bun yet. Not today.
I'm working on it.
Okay, guys. Did I say anything wrong in the first in my intro there?
Hi, I don't think so.
Okay. By the way, it's 5. What time is it? It's 5:51 a.m. there, right? In your bunker in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I had to wake up early for this one.
Oh man, time zones suck. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring up some slides, and we're going to go through step by step to help Christians get smarter and tell other Christians, because they're not going to listen to us. They're not going to listen to Kamil. They're not going to listen to Cam. But maybe there's going to be a few Christians out there who will listen and in the privacy of their own home and take what we have to say and then tell it to other Christians to spread the word for us. So we're going to talk about why the 1042 apologetic is incorrect. And there we go. And, oh, sorry, this should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But here's the bullet points. It's wrong about the literary sources. It ignores other sources. It stretches the window of time to skew the results. Remember, it says 150 years. Habermas said that, and Lycona said that, 150 years. It assumes all sources are equal, and it's flat out wrong and spread by apologists. So we're gonna take the first one, and Kamil, you had some great charts that you made, and I want to bring those up. In fact, you should copyright those charts because somebody's going to use them someday and take credit for it. So here it is. So this is us. This is Socrates. This is Tiberius. Should I make this big and cover ourselves up? Yeah. Let me do that. So you won't be able to see us. But Kamil, why don't you explain what we're looking at here, what the colors represent, and how it applies to what Habermas was saying.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I just took a timeline of Jesus's life and the timeline of Tiberius, and I basically overlaid the dates of death because they didn't die the same year. But basically everything that's dark green was written when the person was still alive. Everything that's light green was written by people who were contemporary, meaning it was written after the person died, but the authors were alive when the person was. And the red stuff was written by people who were born after the person died. And yellow is unknown because it's because they are anonymous. In this case, because I have the chart for other figures like Caligula and Socrates and stuff like that, in this case, it's just the Gospels. And it's important to say that this is incomplete. There's much more sources that we have. For example, when you say that there is more evidence for Jesus than for a Roman emperor, you are probably incorrect just because people actually used the years of reigns of Roman emperors to date documents. So when you wrote a letter and you wanted to put down the year in which you wrote it, you would say, for example, in the 10th year of the reign of Tiberius. And we have a lot of these letters usually in papyri, right? So I just put one example there that's contemporary with Tiberius, but we have many, many examples of this. So yeah, I mean, you can clearly see that we have actually people mentioning Tiberius when he was almost a teenager. I think in his early 20s, like Nepos or Horace, because he was a very famous military leader even before he became the emperor.
Okay, but Habermas said in the video clip I just played that there's only one contemporary source for Tiberius. How can how can a professional historian like Habermas be wrong and you right?
Yeah, I mean, there obviously has to be something going on, right? It could be the case that what he wants to say is that there is only one like substantial source, meaning that like someone writing about Tiberius extensively, like providing some details about his life and stuff like that, which, I mean, if this is what he means, then it could be the case. But the problem is that you then have to apply the same thing to Jesus, right? And imagine if there was someone who lived at the same time as Jesus, for example, Philo of Alexandria, and just happened to mention Jesus randomly in like one sentence, right? I'm sure at that point, all the apologists would be tripping over themselves, showing how good the historical evidence for Jesus is. And it would be very good. Because for a vast majority of people, even religious leaders, we don't have contemporary evidence in the ancient world. So that could be what's going on, or he just didn't do his research.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is, to be clear, we're not saying that we should expect as much evidence as we have for a Roman emperor for Jesus. So don't nobody make the mistake of thinking that that's what like an argument that's going on here. But to be as charitable to Habermas as possible, maybe he's saying main sources in the sense that they are a historian who writes about the person's life in a biographical form, where like major events of the person's life is laid out in a chronological order or is related by theme or something like this. And I think that Tacitus, Suetonius, and the other sources he was identifying probably do fall into that camp. So maybe that's what he means. But the problem is that he doesn't make it clear that there is a whole lot of other evidence, and we will get to some of that soon.
Yeah, I'm thinking if there was, like Kamil said, if there was just one person who's not a historian, I think Robert Price always brings this up, right? That if there was one businessman who happened to be going through Jerusalem, said, "Hey, yesterday I saw this guy named Jesus who performed miracles," and if that was preserved, and we found that, guys like Habermas would be putting it on their list here, but this is not a historian, and they'd be bragging about it, and so how many of these? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 dark green. So these are people who wrote about Tiberius while Tiberius was alive. We have nothing for Jesus at all. Correct?
Yeah, and as I said, there's much more that's contemporary with Tiberius. These are just some examples. Cam said that we shouldn't expect as many sources for Jesus. That's definitely true if you're talking about a historical Jesus, but if you're talking about the Jesus of the New Testament, I would probably disagree, because you have to remember that in the Gospels, he's followed by thousands of people, and he performs like public miracles, right? There are some pretty spectacular miracles going on during the crucifixion that you would expect to be recorded. Yeah,
that's a good caveat. We're talking about the critical scholars' historical Jesus that we wouldn't expect, who was largely a unknown person in the first century.
Okay, and so we have nothing written while people were alive, while Jesus was alive, but we do for Tiberius. And then the light green was basically people who were alive when Tiberius or Jesus were alive and wrote. And we only have one for Jesus, and that's Paul, which we have in the New Testament. And for Tiberius, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sources, which is also incomplete, Kamil?
That's right. It is.
Yeah, all Christians always say that there are like pre-Pauline creeds that are preserved inside Pauline letters, and they also count as independent sources. But if you actually have this standard, then we have many more sources for Tiberius. For example, Tacitus replicates speeches and fragments of letters written by Tiberius himself. So by that standards, we actually have Tiberius's own writing. We don't have like a book that he wrote, but we actually have later historians kind of publishing what he wrote when he was alive. And we have many, many more sources that date much closer to, for example, when Tacitus wrote, because they are actually cited by Tacitus.
Okay.
And Suetonius does the same thing as Tacitus.
Yeah.
And records some of Tiberius's own words, apparently.
For example, Suetonius. Well, no, actually, it's for Caligula. So never mind.
I want to.
For Tiberius.
The people in dark green and light green, do they put their names on their works?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think most of them.
Okay. This is another thing that really bothers me. Christians, if you're listening, this really bothers me. when I hear, well, everybody did it back then. They were anonymous. They didn't put their names on their works. So here we have for Tiberius 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 sources that put their name on their works and talk about Tiberius, and we have only one for Jesus, and that's Paul. If we're talking about people who either were alive when Jesus was alive or wrote when Jesus was alive, it's just, well, we have nothing for Jesus on that.
Well, so we're emphasizing a lot here the numbers, and this is like part of the original apologetic. It was a comparison of numbers. But I think that one point that really needs to be stressed, and it cuts both ways, that we don't consider number of sources to be the most pertinent thing when considering what value a source has for historical events or a historical person. And that's because there are other factors that historians consider more relevant than simply numbers. So, for example, you could have a text that's written about somebody who doesn't exist, or a text that's written narrating an event that didn't happen, and that can get repeated because of the fact that it's believed hundreds of times, and that could inflate a very large statistic when you're just doing source counting. But what we really care about is the type of content that is preserved in a source, and factors that would make that content more expected if it is the case that the person really existed and did what is said, on comparison with other hypotheses.
Yeah, you're talking about not just quantity but quality of work, and this is why I'm bringing up this slide. Kamil, this is yours, right? Is this Dionysius talking about Gaius Caesar?
No, this is Suetonius talking about Caligula. It doesn't actually say Caligula because it wasn't his name. But yeah, this is basically the opening of the biography, and it's great because it shows you how an ancient historian talks about his sources and evaluates them critically. So every basically underlined name is a different source that he's bringing up just to clear up when and where Caligula was actually born. And we have sources like the Gazette, which was basically newspapers, because in Rome at the time they already had newspapers. So by the standard that a Christian would use to say that we have pre-Pauline creeds, because they are preserved in Paul, for Caligula we have newspapers from when he was born, preserved in Suetonius, and I think it's pretty extraordinary. Yeah.
So Luke is always espoused as the best gospel historian, but Luke doesn't even come close to being as specific as Suetonius here.
Yeah, basically all the passages that people bring up when they say that Luke is a good historian, it's basically like the introductory paragraph, would fit inside just this one section where Suetonius talks about when and where Caligula is born. But you have to remember that as ancient historians go, Suetonius is actually considered to be pretty unreliable. Because, for example, he tends to repeat a lot of gossip that probably wasn't true. There was just things that people said about emperors because they were considered like celebrities at the time. So a lot of gossip about their sexual immorality and stuff like that. And also, historians today think that Suetonius probably had some political agenda that motivated him to report things that were being circulated but were probably not true. Like for a lot of the kind of the stereotypes about the Roman emperors, like Caligula being insane, Claudius being basically mentally retarded, and then Nero being this like vain artist, came primarily from Suetonius. But if you actually look at earlier sources for these figures, you don't see that kind of characterization there.
Well, also relevant to Tiberius, isn't it Suetonius who reports his debauchery on Capri?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that goes back to him. I mean, Suetonius, Tiberius gets a pretty bad rap in Tacitus as well, but not nearly as bad.
What kind of debauchery?
So, like having sex with men and throwing them off this giant cliff, if I remember correctly.
Having sex with babies, with infants.
Oh, right.
That's pretty bad. Yeah.
So I just did want to mention one book. If you read like any particular book on Roman historians or Greek and Roman historians, I would pick up Michael Grant's Greek and Roman historians. I think it's Information and Misinformation. And what this book does is it goes through a variety of different examples of like bad historiography in what are effectively the best historians of the time, to indicate how like even those people who were better at it get things wrong and are driven by various biases and etc.
So if you're a Christian listening and you hear another Christian say there's just as much evidence or more evidence for Jesus than other ancient historians, I want you to remember this. You can use these charts or go to this video and you can show them, no, this is not true. And you did this for Socrates compared to Jesus. Why don't you go through this one, Kamil?
Yeah, so Socrates obviously lived much earlier than either Tiberius or Jesus, so we don't have that many sources as we do from the 1st century. Because the 1st century, you have to remember, was one of the golden ages of literature in the ancient world, and we actually have a lot of sources preserved. But for Socrates, which in some cases people even doubt his historicity, we have actually not only sources that obviously were written by people who knew him, like Plato and Xenophon, who both wrote his they basically wrote a fictional version of the defense speech that Socrates gave when he was on trial for atheism, basically, for corrupting the youth. And we even have Aristophanes, his comedy The Cloud, where Socrates is the main character, and it was performed when Socrates was still alive. There is even a source saying that Socrates attended the play. So if we had the same evidence for Jesus, we would have a play written by someone who knew Jesus, because Socrates and Aristophanes both live in Athens and they knew each other, and we would have a later source, for example, Paul, saying that Jesus attended the play. We obviously don't have that.
So even though the 1st century was like a great century for writing stuff, we have here in the 4th century BCE, 400 years before this, better evidence for Socrates than Jesus, or more sources.
I mean, but to play devil's advocate once again, if it is the case that Jesus was this itinerant preacher in an area that had very low literacy rates, and his primary followers, the disciples, were illiterate fishermen and, tax collectors and things like this, we wouldn't really expect to see them writing things about him like we see people writing about Socrates. But
he healed the sick. He brought the dead back to life, Cam.
Right, and so that's like on the Christ of faith. Yes, we would
You
definitely.
can't separate the Christ of faith from the historical Jesus, can you?
Yeah.
I'm gonna go for the Clark Kent and not the Superman.
Yeah, and you have to remember that we actually have a lot of people attested in the first century Palestine, like really obscure Jewish religious leaders and rebel leaders and stuff like that, where almost nobody talks about them. And they were like on the similar level of notoriety as the Jesus of faith. As the Jesus of history. And in some cases, it was even bordering the Jesus of faith. For example, the Egyptian that you know from the book of Acts, that we don't even know what his name was. Josephus just casually mentions that he gathered a following of 30,000 people and he led them somewhere before they were massacred by the Romans. So he was pretty influential figure at the time, but he's only mentioned in Josephus and Acts, as far as I know.
Okay, this is a timeline of specific events in two people's lives. On the left is Jesus, on the right is Tiberius. And this is done by Matthew Ferguson, right? This is not yours, right, Kamil?
Yeah, this is just copied from him. Correct.
And we should point out that Matthew Ferguson, he's a classicist doing his doctoral studies. He wrote a blog article that was addressing specifically the 1042 apologetic. And while like Kamil and I and Doug have like done a lot of investigating of the stuff ourselves, he did an absolutely excellent job of cataloging a lot of the evidence for Tiberius and in particular showing the areas where this 1042 apologetic is invalid.
Yeah, and for Christians listening, there's a debate or conversation on Unbelievable, I think, between him and Craig Evans, right? You remember that, Cam? And I think Craig Evans really liked Matthew Ferguson. He's a very likable guy. So you can go to him as a source as a Christian and not feel like he's just going to mock you, attack you. So the main point of this, Kamil, is to show that when it comes to specific events throughout the life of an individual, we know a lot about Jesus' ministry because of the Gospels, but from Jesus' birth to the point of his ministry, we almost know nothing.
Yeah, this is more like to address the point that, we have like an inscription basically mentioning Tiberius' name, but maybe we don't have that much details about his life compared to Jesus, right? But this just shows the events where we can put a precise date to it. And so in some cases, we even know the exact day, not the year, right? Not just the year. So this just shows that this is incorrect. And again, you would expect to see that if you're talking about the Roman emperor, who even before he became emperor, I think in his 40s or 50s, who had very distinguished military careers. Like these are exactly the type of people who are mentioned in ancient sources in great detail. So you would expect that. That's why if you hear someone saying something like that Jesus is better attested than people like that, there should be immediately red flags, because like if you think about it for 2 minutes, that's not what you would expect.
Okay, so let's move on. It is wrong because of the literary sources. We just showed a whole bunch of literary sources for Tiberius and compared to Jesus. Not only in quantity, but in quality is better. And the second main point against this apologetic is that it ignores other sources. And so, Cam, this is, I'll move it over to you. There's a ton of sources that we have that are not literary. And so, for example, what are we looking at here? This is non-literary source or evidence for Tiberius, I think, right?
I think this is you, Kamil.
Yeah, sure. So this is actually Caligula. This is a tombstone of his mother. So the archaeological evidence is there. If you again, this is something what you would expect. Like for example, for Caligula, we have an amphitheater that he built. It was later demolished, and it was actually excavated. So we have buildings, for example, that were built by these emperors that were later found. We even have inscriptions mentioning that these buildings existed. We have houses that these people lived in, right? Like, imagine if the archaeologists today actually found Peter's house in Capernaum. That would be huge. Like, everyone would be all over this. But
So,
yeah.
Doug, if you go back, I can talk about some of these. I think it's just that you put a Caligula inscription up. If you're wanting to put a Tiberius one, you could put up the Rescepti one, or the Deeds of Divine. Yeah, that one. Okay, so this one here, this was actually something that was written mostly by Augustus, Tiberius's stepfather, and he left it in his will such that upon his death, it would be inscribed on bronze columns to give effectively propaganda for all of the things that Augustus did for the Roman Empire. It gives his deeds and how he paid money out of his own pocket, etc. And in this document that was copied onto other inscription, like other tablets, for example, other than these bronze columns, it mentions Tiberius a couple of times and effectively acknowledges him as a stepson and yeah. And this is from Tiberius's life while he was still alive, because this was published when his father or stepfather died.
Yeah, so when guys like Habermas talk about, not only they're wrong about the quantity and probably even quality of Jesus compared to other ancient figures, they're totally ignoring all this other stuff like inscriptions and like, is it true that Tiberius actually kind of looked like that?
Yeah, so this one's interesting. So with respect to portraits or busts of Tiberius, what art historians know is that there were these particular style types that were used in the official like artists of the like imperial court. And what we find is that there are early busts that were created of Tiberius that use a lot of the same style types as what were being used for Augustus at the end of his reign before he died. And so we see like these commonalities between the busts, and we also see over time the depiction of Tiberius in a variety of busts changing. In particular, he gets depicted quite youthfully even when he was quite old, and he then begins to eventually be depicted slightly older. But it's artistic, it's aesthetic, but he broadly looked like that, and he was known for having particular facial features, and those facial features actually get preserved as well on some coins, which we will see soon.
Don't we have the Shroud of Turin for Jesus?
Yeah, well, this is interesting because, okay, perhaps it is the case that we have the Shroud of Turin, but the thing is that there is so much more debate over something like that. I mean, I, of course, come down on the side of thinking that it's not at all authentic, even that it contradicts with the Gospel of John. But in the case of Tiberius, the particular things that we have depicting him, the physical artifacts from his life, we actually have very high confidence in their provenance.
Okay, so these are the Tiberius denarius coins.
So what's fascinating about this one is that you may have noticed that on Kamil's earlier slide, he actually put the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Luke, because what we find is that the Gospels, because of the fact that Jesus is set in 30 AD, they actually make mention to Caesar, or in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John, even specifically to Tiberius, or John at least mentions Lake Tiberius. But with Mark, there is the story in Mark 12 where, in a discussion about Rome, effectively, Jesus is given a coin and looks at a coin, and he says, like, does this coin not bear the likeness of Caesar? And the Caesar that we know that he's talking about is Tiberius. And then he says the famous line, "Well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's." So if it is the case that this Markan story is actually authentic, Jesus in his lifetime was literally looking at a coin that had Tiberius's face on it. And I find that really quite amusing.
What's this part? Is that a god?
So that is a depiction of pax or peace, and in particular, like these numismatic historians, like these people who are experts in coins, they think specifically that this is actually meant to depict Livia, Tiberius's mother, but it's actually like the symbol of peace. And on the left-hand side there, you have maximum, I think, and then on the right-hand side you have pontiff, and that's Pontiff Maxima. It's like the highest high priest office of the imperial cult.
And doesn't it say Augustus Divi? What does divi mean in Latin, Cam?
Yeah, so on the face of it, yeah, it does. It says Augustus Divi, and it actually says Tiberius as well, but it doesn't say Tiberius's full name. It uses this convention where it's shortened down, so it says something more like T Caesar, I think it is. But yeah, the Augustus Divi means like, Augustus God, like the divine Augustus.
So Jesus was looking. One savior was looking at the coin of another savior.
Yeah, well, according to, for example, the Priene calendar inscription, Augustus was actually considered, the good news to the Roman Empire, and he was considered the savior, the soter of the Roman people. So yeah, one savior to another. And so this is just the same effectively, but it's a gold coin. It actually has pretty much the same content on it. It's just a higher quality. This here is what happened is later in Tiberius's years, there was like a lot of conspiracy that he was being fed by this figure named Sejanus, and conspiracy that Tiberius was going to like maybe be harmed or killed or something like that if he stayed in Rome. And so he actually eventually isolated himself on this island of Capri and continued on in Augustus's tradition of building buildings on Capri. And in particular, he appears to have built this is like we get references from later historians, but then archaeology seems to bear out the same claims of this place called the Villa of Jupiter, effectively, which was Tiberius's home for many years on Capri, and was effectively the place that he lived for many years. And it's huge. What you see there at the top is actually a church. It's a modern building, but the lower parts are all the ruins of the original villa.
So Habermas is saying the evidence for Jesus is as good as the sources of Jesus is as good as for Tiberius, but we actually know Tiberius's house, and we also know that he had a big nose. At least it looks like he has a big nose. Here the nose is chopped off, I guess. What's this house?
So this one here was a temple to Augustus, like the divine Augustus. And so this is in this area in Rome, which a whole bunch of like Roman imperial buildings were built. And it looks as though either Livia or most probably Tiberius completed the construction of this temple to the divine Augustus.
But did they sign it, or how do we know that?
There may be inscriptions surviving from it, but
did Tiberius put his handprints into the wall or something?
That would be nice. I don't think so, though.
What are we looking at here?
So this one's interesting. So this is like a judgment from the Senate during the time of Tiberius's life that Tiberius actually weighs in on. And in particular, it's because of some, it's like a judicial thing, effectively, where somebody is on trial and it makes mention directly to Tiberius as Caesar at the time.
Okay.
If I remember correctly.
So not only
here we are. I can read a little bit of it. Right. Whereas Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the deified Augustus, Pontifex Maximus, in the 22nd year of his tribunician power, having been consul 3 times, consul designate for the 4th time, referred to the Senate for decision, and then it goes on to give like a description of the case.
Okay, so not only is there much fewer sources for Jesus, but for Jesus we have none of the stuff that we are talking about here. No busts, no inscriptions, no tombstones, no homes, nothing. We have no hard physical evidence. This third point is something that Matthew Ferguson brought up, and I thought it was good, and that is that this 1042 apologetic, it stretches the window of time to skew the results. In other words, why would guys like Kona and Habermas use 150 years as opposed to 75 years or 100 years or 300 years? What's your guess on that? And I want to bring up Kamil's nice chart.
Yeah, Kamil, do you want to weigh in on that?
Like, what would happen?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Kamil.
Yeah, because they get more sources for Jesus. I mean, that's probably the only reason, right? And I mean, and again, first of all, we are not saying that this is true, therefore Jesus didn't exist as a historical person, right? That would be insane. Because as I said, we have a lot of examples of people who are roughly similar to Jesus in that they were Jewish leaders in the 1st century Palestine, and they are recorded just in Josephus very briefly, but we still think that they existed, right? So this is not the case. But and it's also not that important, like how long the source is after the person died. I think this gets overemphasized. Like you can get reasonably good quality of the evidence, even if it's very late. You have to look at like the nature of the source. That's much more important. But yeah, I think they are probably just playing a numbers game, basically.
Okay, Kamil, when you made your chart, you went about 100 years after the deaths of Tiberius and Jesus, it looks like.
Yeah, it's just we have so many early good quality sources that I think this is sufficient. Because if you find someone who's mentioning the person when the person was still alive, you then don't have to go 150 years after that.
But if
right?
better. But if we were to expand this out another 50 years or so, would Jesus now overtake Tiberius?
I don't think so. Definitely, if you're going by like mutually independent sources, which is a whole other debate. Because for Jesus, we would start getting literature writers, which there are some, but it's not a massive number, especially not the very early ones. But also they are dependent on the Gospels, obviously. Like they didn't know Jesus personally or anything like that. The only other guy who would maybe qualify it is Papias, because he supposedly preserves some sayings of Jesus that were not that are not included anywhere else. So he would maybe count as independent source.
Yep.
And he mentions his sources, unlike the Gospels. So if Papias says that he knew a guy named John, and that was his source, I'm wondering why the Gospels don't do the same.
So,
but that's just an aside.
If you're a Christian listening and you really want to have fun, and if you ever are in a room in a presentation of Habermas or Lycona, and they bring up anything related to this about sources for Jesus compared to other ancient figures, you can get like a million. No, not a million. I better be careful. I don't want to give out a free trip to Vegas. You'll get 10,000 Pine points from me. If you ask this question to Lycona or Habermas, what if we were to make that 150 years or so after Jesus down to 50 or 75? How would Jesus compare to Tiberius? And see what they say. In fact, they're going to go, they're going to stutter, and they're going to, we haven't really crunched the numbers on that one. But in general, whenever an apologist or a historian mentions numbers, ask what happens if those numbers were to change. Test those numbers out and see how they respond. Cam, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of thoughts. Like, yeah, as Kamil said, the stretching just really does seem to be a way to inflate the statistic, even though the statistic that they give in the book is actually wrong when you actually look at the sources for Tiberius. But I do want to note that Lycona did actually publish a blog post entitled "Humble Pie," where he does admit that the work of Matthew Ferguson makes him aware of sources that he wasn't aware of prior. But my issue, and perhaps we'll get into this a little bit later, is that I don't think that simply saying that is sufficient to overcome the fact that you effectively launched an apologetic that I still hear repeated by Christians to this day on a fairly regular basis.
That's a great point, Cam, and I got it here. This is from Matthew Ferguson's blog, and I don't know if this is true or not, but this is Matthew Ferguson claiming that he first mentions this guy named Cliff Kneckel. I actually interacted with this guy at the University of Arizona because he does a lot of talks there. But Matthew Ferguson says that Mike Lycona has admitted that the 1042 apologetic is wrong. Here it is. But since Lycona has acknowledged that making errors with the same statistic in the case for the resurrection of Jesus, his statement about the sources for Tiberius versus Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus can be considered likewise conceded. Gary Habermas, the other co-author, also cites the 1042 apologetic in Resurrected. So it's not clear to me if Gary Habermas has conceded that this apologetic is faulty.
Yeah, well, I do know that Gary Habermas still uses the one with respect to Alexander, which I also think is wrong, which perhaps Kamil will get into later with one of his fancy charts. Beautiful charts. But yeah, I think that Lycona, I really plead with you, go spend 2 weeks or something like that and write a really excellent article on our sources for Tiberius and help clear out this rubbish apologetic that's floating around in Christian circles and misleading the public about our sources for Roman emperors. I don't have any particular, I don't love Tiberius or anything like that, but to me it's a bit of an issue that there are these public lies out there that could be easily corrected with a small amount of work by somebody who has the authority that you have.
Yeah, I think the reason why we're talking about it is because we just happened to came across another person, like a Christian, who was peddling this. So we thought we might do a video, right? Because even though some of the originators of this have apologized, basically, the damage is already massive, right? So it takes much more time to correct misinformation than to spread it. And it's not just Lycona and Habermas. There are many other apologists who are kind of doing the same thing. For example, it's very unfortunate, but there is an email that was sent by Inspiring Philosophy to N.T. Wright, who is a very good scholar.
Slight correction there. It was sent by somebody who Inspiring Philosophy knows.
Oh, okay.
But it wasn't sent by him. But he published it.
Yeah, there you go. This is how you get to confusion in ancient sources. But basically, N.T. Wright said, don't worry about it. Caligula is in the same, on the same level when it comes to ancient sources as Jesus. This is why we're talking about Caligula as well, right? Which is how do you get this much education in this and still say something like that, right? If Lycona says that he was only made aware of these extra sources after Matt Ferguson wrote the article, how did he get a PhD in ancient history? Because it's not like some obscure inscription somewhere in Asia Minor. It's Horace or Cornelius Nepos. These are the people that you are given to read when you are getting graduate level training in ancient history, right? So
yeah, this is why us three guys are doing this, because there are people still on Facebook using this apologetic, saying things that are wrong. And here's an opportunity for Christians listening to you'll get a lot of bonus points from not only non-Christians, but even in your own in-group. You can say, look, guys, you got to stop this. N.T. Wright is one of these guys. And what Kamil was just saying, we have the evidence right here. Thank you, Jose. I think the answer is that Price and Carey are not well qualified. New Testament scholars, like even that alone, Price and Carey are not qualified scholars. Price has 2 PhDs in the field, and Hopper too. I have actually never heard of any of them. N.T. Wright, you've never heard of? Is this possible that he hasn't heard of these guys? Not one of them. But in any case, the evidence for Jesus is much wider than the Josephus passage. Jesus is well established as a figure of history, as is, say, the Emperor Caligula. Wrong. N.T. Wright, you're wrong. His near contemporary. It is frustrating when people write rubbish. And yes, I agree. It's frustrating when people write rubbish like you, N.T. Wright, right here, right now. And ordinary folk are deceived, but this happens all the time, and one cannot always be correcting bad history, blah, blah, blah. And here's another quote from N.T. Wright. Second, I have taken for granted that Jesus of Nazareth existed. Now, again, what Kamil said, I'm just going to second. This is not about whether or not Jesus existed or not. This is about comparing sources to other ancient figures. Some writers feel the need to justify this assumption at length against people who try from time to time to deny it. It would be easier, frankly, to believe that Tiberius Caesar, Jesus' contemporary, was a figment of the imagination, that to believe that there was never such a person as Jesus. Those who persist in denying this obvious point will probably not want to read a book like this anyway. Cam, do you remember what book this quote's from?
Oh,
I forgot to source it.
I'll get a few. It's not the resurrection of Jesus, because I know that he has one like that.
You know what I just realized? So here, N.T. Wright is basically saying, look, if you're a mythicist, you're not going to be willing to hear what I have to say. But we actually have an email in which he says that he's never heard of Robert Price or Richard Carrier, which makes me think, like, if you don't know them and you don't know their work, you're not really engaging with their arguments, right? Like, I would want people who criticize them and disagree with them to at least know who they are and what they're saying, right? Even if I'm not a mythicist myself. So, yeah. It's really weird.
So, so one thing to note is that I'm sure N.T. Wright did not know that email exchange was going to be put in the public space. But regardless, he shouldn't really be making those claims in private anyway. It was specifically from Jesus and the Victory of God. That was the book name.
Okay, thanks. And I just want to have that for the record. I want to just checking my notes. There's one thing I want to talk about with that 150-year thing. Matthew Ferguson makes a great point. Consider an analogy with Joseph Smith, the guy who started Mormonism. Most of us today are familiar with Joseph Smith over 150 years after his death. But how many are familiar with his contemporary, U.S. President John Tyler? I know Kamil and Cam, because they're not American. Actually, you're not. There's no Americans in this room right now, in this live stream. I wasn't even aware of John Tyler, at least maybe in the back recesses of my mind. But he's making a great point that if you go farther out about Jesus, that's when the religion started taking off, and so therefore, and that's the time when people start forgetting about political leaders. So for the same reason, most people have no clue about the life of John Tyler, the 10th U.S. president of the United States. I looked it up before this show. For the same reason, there might be fewer writings about Tiberius, 150 in the 2nd century. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in. Now, I want to also throw in how this misinformation is just rampant amongst evangelicals, and that the Facebook post, let's see if I can find it, is why we're doing this. So was it you, Cam? You were on some Facebook group. Do you want to say which group it was?
Yeah, I won't say which group it was, but
okay. So anyhow, there's a Facebook group. I blocked. You
don't want to know what dark recesses of the internet I've been on.
So this is just a guy on a Facebook group saying a couple things that I find helpful. We have more sources for Jesus' existence than the Roman emperor at the time. That's false. We have a lot of arguments on who Jesus really was from a bunch of different groups: Christians, Jews, agnostics, That's kind of true. We have sources from the Gospels and early church fathers stating a lot of things we know about this Jesus, where he was born, and so forth. We have opponents of Christianity not arguing Jesus' existence, all the followers. Okay, so he's talking about mythicism here. But then someone asked him, what do you mean about point 1? We have more sources for Jesus' existence than the Roman emperor at the time. And this was this person's response. We have 4 main sources for each. For Jesus, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Q, maybe, dated anywhere between there. The earliest incomplete copies there. But for Tiberius Caesar, our main sources are this, dated here. And so basically what he's doing, what this person on Facebook is doing, is he's spewing stuff he's probably read from guys like this. Norman Geisler in, which book was it?
And Frank Turek, the co-author.
So if you're a Christian and you have Norman Geisler and Frank Turek's book, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, you're getting this misinformation into your head. And if you are talking to knowledgeable guys like Cam and Kamil on Facebook, and if you actually care for a second to research what they're saying, you're going to find out, oops, these guys are right, and Frank Turek and Norman Geisler are wrong. And it's going to make you look and feel bad. But you could be a hero if you flip it around and do this with what we're doing, do it with your Christian friends.
Yeah, and I think that this goes, the evidence of a variety of apologists repeating this apologetic, I think it comes back to your claim, Doug, about being desirous for certain things to be true because they support, what would be useful to you. And I think it is the case that a variety of folks here, even like well-respected people within the Christian community, are just not checking these things that are really easily checked. Like, it's actually really easy to check the sources for Tiberius. Like, you can do, of course, it's easier now because there are popular blog articles disputing things, but you can go get a biography of Tiberius written by a historian, and you can find in that biography, busts, coins, references to a variety of early references to him. And so all it takes is going and getting a biography of the figure. And the same thing is kind of true of Alexander the Great. You can go get that and a biography of that, and you can find out that, it's not as simple as these people are presenting it.
So if you're a Christian and you have in your library a book called The Compelling Evidence for God in the Bible by Douglas Jacoby, he has false information in there because he's using the 1042 apologetic. If you have in your study a book called Stand Your Ground by Dean Hardy, again, false information in it. If you have I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, false information. What else do I have here?
Yeah, this is really bothering me because, if I bought a book and this was in it, I would be really considering, what else is false, right? This really lowers my standard, it really lowers my confidence in other things that, for example, Mike Licona has to say. He probably knows more about Christianity than he knows about ancient history, Greco-Roman, right? But come on, this is really basic stuff. Tiberius was the emperor. He wasn't some obscure figure, right?
Okay, this is the last slide I have, guys. But this, Kamil, you made, right? Or did you get this from Matthew?
Yeah, if I knew that you were going to show this, I would fill in some of the blanks. But yeah, I think we do have contemporary statues of Caesar. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that's fine. I don't feel embarrassed. But I thought this was a brilliant, brilliant chart. And so very quickly, you can have these ancient figures like Jesus, Alexander the Great, Caligula, Spartacus, Hannibal, Caesar, Tiberius, and Socrates. And you can go through these columns, say, do we have contemporary sources? No for Jesus, yes for the rest. Early sources, yes, if you count, people who were alive when the person was alive. We have Paul for Jesus, but just one. Contemporary statues, no, but for a lot of these, yes, we have statues. Contemporary coins, no for Jesus, of course, but yes for a lot of these guys. Contemporary inscriptions, no for Jesus, of course, but yes for a lot of these. Do we have their own writings? Jesus never wrote anything, except on the sand that one time, I think, about the Samaritan woman. But with a lot of these other figures, we have what they actually wrote with their own hand. That's pretty amazing.
Sometimes in quotation, but
So
Yeah, I think here I only included like actual writings, like on tablets and inscriptions and stuff like that. Because in some cases, like for Alexander the Great, for example, the way how these ancient rulers operate was that they issued policy basically in a form of a letter. So they would write a letter to a city, giving them privileges and stuff like that. And the city would obviously engrave the letter on a rock, basically. But they would create an inscription, and that inscription still exists today. So we actually know like a letter that, if not Alexander himself, it was at least composed by someone who did like official administration for him. And you know what's great about this? You know how there is a lot of debates about the manuscript would corruption and like how many errors are there in early New Testament manuscripts, where these documents are actually the originals. They are the autographs, right? So when we, for example, have a papyri of a letter that uses Tiberius's name for dating, that's the original. We don't have copies of copies. So if we had something like that mentioning the name of Jesus, that would be amazing.
it would, but there is this person, MTN Show 1, and I just want to do their comment justice. They say, that's not a fair table. Jesus wasn't a political or military leader. There wouldn't be much archaeology for Jesus. And that is precisely right. The table isn't presented in order to suggest that we would expect these things for Jesus. It's in order to rebut the claim that the sources for Jesus are as good as what they are for these other figures, which is this claim that commonly gets made. So you're totally right. We don't expect these sources, or at least on the assumption that of a historical Jesus, not a Christ of faith.
but the people doing this 1042 apologetic, we're not talking about the historical Jesus, we're talking about the Christ. So in their heads, the Christ did far greater things than Tiberius.
Yeah, well, so he did miracles in public display. He was known like across his news of him spread across the world. I think like Luke or Mark, I can't remember which one, says that news of him spread all across Syria.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can recall, Kamil or Doug, but
there's two of them, one Syria, one Judea.
Yeah, at his death, there were these, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, these apocalyptic events going on in Jerusalem. Of course, a lot of the people in the stream probably don't believe that those things are true. But, if you do take the Gospels as representing history, then those things we would expect to find some evidence for at least, and we don't. So the Christ of faith, we might expect more evidence comparable to Tiberius. But yes, the historical Jesus, who was largely a nobody, yes, we don't expect this kind of evidence.
Yes, Ken Scaletta, the table isn't supposed to disprove the existence of Jesus, just to debunk the claim that we have more info about him than Tiberius, or even equal. It's not close. That apologetic about Tiberius and Jesus, that Habermas, Lacona has admitted that it has false information in it, but Habermas hasn't. What we're saying is, you can be a hero as a young Christian, telling your Christian friends, stop it with this. We have as much for Jesus as Tiberius, because you don't.
Yeah, and so like a good heuristic is that you should almost have a BS detector. If you hear somebody claiming that we have better evidence for Jesus than some kind of emperor or political leader or that kind of thing, it's probably not true. And you should just kind of doubt that claim to begin with. And that's not necessarily because the evidence for Jesus is bad. It's just because these people just had such a huge impression directly on history because of their prominence.
Isn't the evidence for Jesus bad, Cam?
I think it is, but there are historicists who think that it's quite good.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what exactly are you asking, right? Like, is it good enough for thinking that he existed as a person? I think yes. But is it enough to think that he probably, I don't know, turned water into wine or like fed 3,000 people? Probably no.
What are the non-Christian sources claimed besides Josephus for Jesus? Raphael's asking. I have that in the chart. But you guys know off the top of your head?
They claim Tacitus, Phlegon, Pliny the Younger,
Suetonius. And then Lucianos around 160. Obviously, some of these sources are disputed. Like there are Saint Richard Carrier, for example, disputes Tacitus, right? There is an interesting article where textual critics actually used like computer-assisted textual criticisms. Like there are basically now computer programs that you can train to evaluate literary styles and stuff like that. They can basically do the work that 100 years ago you had to have a German guy spending 30 years going through the sources. And they took that program and they ran the letters of Pliny talking about Jesus or talking about Christ. H doesn't mention Jesus through that. And it found out that it wasn't actually written by Pliny. So now there is this debate whether even that evidence is authentic or whether that's a letter that was actually written by Christians later. But yeah, I mean, even if we just go by the undisputed sources, then I think it's not terrible.
Yeah, and I think Matthew Ferguson gets into a fair bit of detail on this, but me listing out those folks before, those sources, is not to say that I agree that they actually do provide unproblematic references to Jesus. For example, if I recall correctly, Suetonius really only mentions Christians. I don't think that he mentions actually Jesus.
Yeah,
I might be wrong about that. But...
Yeah, he mentions Christians, and then he mentions Chrestos, who in connection with the Jews in Rome, not with Christians. So there is this hypothesis that around the same time as I think Claudius, there was a guy named Chrestos who is also attested by Cassius Dio, who was some like a Jewish instigator, and he incited some stuff, and that led to the expulsion of Jews from Rome. Which, if this is the case, it really complicates stuff because it just happened. It just happens to be the case that there was a guy who had a name that's kind of similar to Jesus.
And I think that the Phlegon reference.
You guys are
really
you guys are getting too deep. Yeah, you guys are getting too deep.
Yeah, sure.
David B is asking. So 60-second answers. David B is asking, does the supernatural claim entailed in the minimal facts not reduce the plausibility of otherwise mundane claims? So David B is asking, the fact that guys like Habermas talk about the minimal facts, but it's right next to these claims of the fantastical, should we not reduce the plausibility of even the mundane claims? David B, the answer is yes, you should reduce the plausibility of the otherwise mundane claims, and here's why. Christian person listening who are disagreeing with me right now, you're sitting next to me on a bench. Park bench. You don't know who I am. You've never seen me before. I'm sitting next to you on a bench. I look you in the eyes and I say, I walked on water last week. And you kind of just look at me. Okay. And then I say to you, I rose a person from the dead a month ago. And you kind of, you're starting to shift away from me. And then I say, oh, I divided loaves and fishes and fed 5,000 people. And then I say, the last thing I tell you is, I own a Lexus car. Now, I could own a Lexus car, but at that point, haven't you written me off and said, you know what? I can't really trust whatever this guy says. This guy's nutso, and I'm not going to give him the time of day. This is basically Robert Price's argument with Clark Kent and Superman. Clark Kent, there's nothing extraordinary about Clark Kent, but Clark Kent's alter ego is Superman. Actually, the other way around. And so you can't separate those two guys. So you got to take the package deal. And if you're going to doubt one side, if you're going to doubt Clark Kent, you have to doubt the Superman. If you doubt Superman, you have to doubt Clark Kent. So great question.
Except for the fact that we do have figures in history who we do think are historical, that we see a mythologization occurring with them such that they get a variety of claims attached to them that are similar to what we find attached to Jesus. And like one example would be somebody who is actually almost contemporary with Jesus, Apollonius of Tyana, where he gets many of the same attributes attached to him as a figure, yet historians do actually think he's probably historical. And his life is recorded in Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana. And like I said, it contains many of the same types of claims as what we find for Jesus.
Yeah, and also Octavian, right? Augustus, Caesar Augustus.
Yeah, he gets claimed to have, like settled the storms. I don't know if that's a metaphor, but he gets claimed to have healed people too in Philo's, I think, embassy to Gaius. But as well, Vespasian, as I think I've talked about on this channel before, in, I think, Cassius Dio and Suetonius and Tacitus gets claimed to have healed people healed a blind man, I think, and a person with a withered hand, if I'm remembering correctly.
So how do you think historians separate the fantastical from the real history? Just by saying by prior probability?
Yeah, well, I mean, they start off by using broadly the principle of analogy. So we in historical reasoning, we have to have some type of background context through which to evaluate the plausibility of claims. And our background context that we use is other things within history that occurred as well as things that happened in our present day. And which is not to say that things can't happen that are different from what we usually see, but it at least is something that gives us graded levels of confidences before evaluating the evidence. And then the other thing is that the object of a historian when assessing a piece of data, which is what really sources present to us, they present data, the object of the historian is to try to give a comparison of explanations of what accounts for that data. So in the case of Vespasian, having him claimed to have performed miracles was a means by which propagandists working under Vespasian, the Flavians in particular, it was a means by which they could legitimate the claim of his emperorship. And so there are explanations for why it is that these things would be claimed about Vespasian that don't rely on it actually having been historical fact. And when you're in a position where you have a equally good explanation of the data with a hypothesis that is usually something that happens versus an explanation that is a hypothesis that very rarely happens, then you're in a position where you can make a judgment.
David B. says, just to be clear, what I mean is that even if no extraordinary claim was made explicitly, the mundane claim should not be treated as mundane if they do entail something extraordinary. I don't understand what you're saying, David.
Perhaps what he's talking about is what I think I got this from Robert Price, like to call the yellow brick road, where, and he may not be saying this, but I think it's a nice analogy. There is this argument, if the Emerald City doesn't exist, then where is it that the yellow brick road leads? And obviously the mistake here is that the yellow brick road has been taken to be something that's real, and it's being used as an argument for the Emerald City, where the yellow brick road is really part of the Wizard of Oz story. And so what someone might like to say is that when you're taking the narrative details in the Gospel of Mark leading up to the resurrection account too seriously, you're sort of falling into the mistake of playing on the yellow brick road, so to speak.
Okay, someone wants us to explain Genesis 5 for $5. It's a trap, but I'm curious what they're talking about. I guess the question I think earlier was about the Gospels found in Genesis 5. Oh, yes, the history of Adam's family. Yeah. Explain, if you're a Christian listening, whenever you say the words, explain to me, you need to look inward and say to yourself, why am I asking this question? Explain to me X. And then you fill in the blank what X is. And I get this sense that Christians think that, who do this, they think that if you can't explain it, that means that whatever you're espousing or whatever you believe is true or likely to be true. And that doesn't follow. And
What's in Genesis 5?
it's
genealogies, or
yeah, I think I know who this person is who's asking the question.
I think it starts with the Tower of Babel, then there is a genealogy, and then it starts the story of Abraham. Am I wrong?
Yeah, and I think the question is, how does Genesis 5 relate to the gospel? Or if none of this was true, how can in the Gospel of Luke, is this genealogy found?
No, it's just a genealogy. I was probably confusing it with some other chapter. Yeah, I don't understand what the question is.
Yeah,
neither do I.
My guess is it's for the person who asked the question, Jay, is it? If you're asking how can the genealogies be the same in the Gospels, well, they knew the Old Testament and they just penned it in. Now, I think what you're asking is, okay, you can claim New Testament, use Old Testament. How is the Gospel hidden? But how is the Gospel hidden? Yeah, Jan, sorry. I think he's going to. It's one of those code things that there's meanings with the names within the genealogy. Guitar Dog asks, why is there such weak evidence for the most important event in all history?
Well, I think that Christian apologists, they actually really try to claim that there's very good evidence. So your characterization of the evidence right out of the gate would be met with a lot of skepticism and from an apologist, because they think the type of evidence that we have for Jesus points almost deductively to the resurrection claim. Now,
yeah,
but
on the other hand, you do have Christians who are fideists or presuppositionalists. Like, there are actually presuppositionalists who do videos showing how the evidential arguments for God or Jesus specifically are weak, because they want to motivate you to use presuppositional apologetic instead. And then there are actually Christians, including Christian scholars, who admit that there isn't enough epistemic justification for believing that the resurrection happened on the historical grounds. They just have a different justification. For example, they are pragmatic, or they are cultural Christians, or something like that. So you can find Christian scholars who publish in academia who say, if you think that you can establish a resurrection as a historical event, you are nuts. Like that, for example, Mike Lacona, for example, did debates with Christians that actually dispute that you can establish the resurrection using the historical methods, like John Dominic Crossan and others. So
yeah, I think you're right. There's Christians quite across the spectrum on this, and there are definitely folks who think that historical methods can't get you there, and instead, the justification from theist comes from revelation for the Christian believer. In fact, like you were saying, there are some that go so far as to say that really the evidential style arguments are almost a perversion of the gospel and bordering on heretical.
Yeah, you're standing in judgment over God, right? When you evaluate the evidence and trying to figure out, does he exist? Maybe.
Yeah, those are the precepts. They don't do that. They think it's a sin to actually talk about the evidence because it puts God on trial.
Yeah, there's probably something to say to that in the scriptures. Like if we could travel back in time and talk to Paul, I'm not sure how happy he would be with what like Mike Lacona is doing. Maybe he would say, you just have to have faith. But that's obviously controversial.
Well, what do you guys like? I want to say, and I shouldn't, because it kind of is different than the topic of this live stream. But to me, it's just painfully clear that, like this guy named Jan in the chat, who I had to put in a timeout because he wanted to list all the meanings of all the words in the genealogy of Genesis 5 to prove that this has to be in divine in nature to show that the Gospels are true. But in my mind, I'm just perceiving this guy as Jesus. He had an experience of Jesus that he believes was from Jesus, and Jesus radically changed his life, that he believes this is what happened to him. And then afterwards, when he feels kind of like, is this really true? He finds out stuff like Genesis 5, and he puts it together. Man, yes, what I believe is true. And I just think this happens time and time again, that, your beliefs come first, your reasons come second, and you try desperately to justify what you believe is actually true. And just like this 1042 apologetic, hey, I brought it back around. This 1042 apologetic does the exact same thing. It's Habermas and Lacona have this desirous belief that they just want this to be true. For Lacona, it was probably some miracle in his life. It's flying trash can lids. With Habermas, I don't know. And it's just like you desperately want this evidence to fit what you already believe and give you confidence that, yes, this is true. I'm not stupid for believing this stuff. I think this is what's going on.
Yeah, is the claim that the genealogies somehow talk about Jesus when you like do some fancy stuff with it?
Yeah, when you look at the
Because
meanings.
if that's the case, they probably also talk about the assassination of JFK if you do enough work on those, right?
Yeah,
Like you can get
if
you can get a lot of
if I was a betting man, I'd bet that this guy Jan also is a 9/11 truther and that sort of thing. Captain Fartlicker asks, why were some Roman emperors deified and some not? That's a good question.
Yeah, because those that were not are probably like not very good people. Because it started with Augustus, then I think Tiberius was deified, then
I think, not an emperor, but I think like Julius Caesar was.
yeah, that's actually a good point. Yeah, so I think it goes up to Claudius, except Caligula wasn't, and then Vespasian and Titus were deified, and then I don't know. But yeah, I mean, if the question is why they were deified in the first place, it was kind of assumed that this was like a power move, that it was a way for them to cement their power. But actually now it looks like more and more this idea that the emperor is a god was more like a bottom up, like a ground up social event, like social phenomena, where we have evidences of people, especially in the eastern parts of the empire, that were kind of setting up temples to the emperors, particularly to Augustus, fairly early on, without him necessarily like ordering it. It was just a normal mode of showing your loyalty to whoever happens to be in power at any given time, because we have obviously many people who were considered divine before then and were ruling over the same people. And then if the question is why these particular emperors were not deified, then it's usually because they were not considered like a very good people at the time. For example, Caligula was assassinated by a conspiracy that involved the aristocracy. So the people who killed him are obviously not then going to vote on him being a god, right? Which is interesting because Claudius probably was mentally ill or like mentally handicapped, but he still was deified after he died, and he was probably also assassinated. So it's probably a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, and like you were saying, in the East, there was a lot of deification of like kings and like for example, like the pharaohs are good examples, or even like Alexander the Great, and yeah, there's lots of examples prior to the Romans doing it.
Yes, Ken Scaletta, Octavian was called as savior to the Romans. He brought the good news, the gospel, to the people.
There's actually a great meme. So a Roman poet called Virgil, who worked before Jesus. Well, I think he died when Jesus was a teenager. He wrote a poem celebrating Augustus as a son of God, and it actually uses language which is so similar to how Christians later talked about Jesus, that in the 4th century they became convinced that even though Virgil was a pagan and he lived before Jesus, this poem is actually a prophecy about Jesus. So they started like celebrating Virgil as a kind of this noble poet who just happened to live before the gospel, but he was actually secretly being fed prophecies by the Christian God. And he was kind of elevated to a very high status among in Christian literature. This is, for example, why he's depicted as the companion to Dante in the Divine Comedy. Christians were so good in finding Jesus in the Bible that they actually started seeing him even in pagan literature.
Am83330, $10 donation. Thank you so much. What's the earliest reference of Christians saying they could never lose their salvation? Once saved, always saved, or eternal security? Oh, I know the answer to this question. You're in luck. The earliest reference that I know of is in the Gospel of John, where it says, "No one can take the person from the Father's hand." What's the? You remember, Cam? I think it's in the Gospel of John. Don't make me look it up.
That's the top of my head. I don't know. But that's a good question.
But that's the go-to verse for most people who believe once saved, always saved.
And it would be interesting to look up when this was actually first formulated as a point in theology, right? Because that could go way late. Maybe Augustine, because I know a lot of later Protestants like Martin Luther based some of their stuff on Augustine, but I'm not that familiar with that.
So maybe it was this one that you were talking about, Doug, John 3:15-18. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. No, hold on. That whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already. Yeah.
No, that's
maybe
not
that
it.
one.
No,
that's not it.
No one can take the child out of the.
He who believes in him is not condemned. I don't know. Anyway.
Someone in the live stream chat, look it up. It's it's taking the out of the Father's hand. The word hand is in it.
Right. Kamil, back to what you were saying before, it reminded me of the fact that Justin Martyr says that, that Jesus is much like those who the Greeks follow. And in fact, eventually this develops into a full-blown apologetic that says the reason why it is the case that Jesus was like Heracles and all of these other figures is the fact that prior to Jesus's existence, the devil had effectively been whispering these things into the ears of the variety of people who came to believe them. Yeah. So
NT writes primarily a preacher, not a scholar. I can buy that. DB Cisco, thanks for the donation. Mark 16:6, he got up is the unbiased translation from the Greek, not he is risen. Ah, interesting. He got up. Jesus was in the tomb and he got up.
Yeah, I don't really agree with that, but
he got up and went to heaven, like up to heaven.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, well, to me at least, it's clear that the empty tomb and the end of the Gospel of Mark from 16 through to verse 15 is indicating that Jesus has come back alive again, which is why the angel or like the young man says, go meet him in Galilee where he said that he would meet you. I think that like you're trying to make a rationalist. I mean, I don't know what DB Cisco's trying to say about that, but I think it's splitting hairs.
Thank you, Stalemate IB. John 10, 28 to 30 is what I was talking about, I think. Nobody could take the child out of the father's hand. Rembrandt, but the Bible also says that Jesus will not recognize many who claim to believe. That's true. Verily, verily, I say unto thee, you cast demons in my name, but I say to you, I never knew you. Something like that. I think it's in the Gospel of Mark. And so there's, surprise, surprise, verses in the Bible that show that nothing can take you out of the Father's hand, that you're once saved, always saved, and yet you can think that you're saved and maybe not. Mountain Show 1 says, PineCreek, when will Jesus appear to Mike Winger and say, thanks, buddy, but how about you set this out going forward? Oh, man. I've noticed that Mike Winger is doing more, how should I say, theological type live streams or content rather than showing that the Bible's true. Have you guys noticed that? Anyhow.
Yeah. So back to DB Cisco, like he wants to know why. I'm not saying that, for example, if that word was used in another context that didn't pertain to anything like resurrection, that it couldn't mean to get up or to stand up or something like that. But I'm meaning that in this context, it clearly means that he resurrected. And in fact, if you go and read the book by John Cook, he gives an analysis of this particular word in prior literature that defends the position that this would mean for the Markan author, that he was trying to signal that Jesus did resurrect or, come back to life.
Yeah, in ancient Greek, generally words have a much wider semantic range, which means that if you are really like pedantic about it, you can take the word and show that it could mean something completely different or something like very mundane. But you then have to like look at the context to kind of know what the particular author is saying at the particular time, right? I think in the Gospel of Mark, it's pretty clear what's supposed to be going on, even if the word can just mean, to got up early in the morning.
This question is for you, I think, Kamil. Captain Liquor of Farts asks, okay, you're in a time machine. You go back to Palestine 2,000 years ago. You're walking around in Palestine. How, out of 100 people, how many of them will be speaking Greek?
Yeah, I think it depends on where exactly you would be, because I think the consensus is that the larger the population center, the more Hellenized it was. So, for example, in Decapolis, which I think it's usually considered to be in Palestine, that was much more Hellenized. There is also a debate about Galilee specifically, like how Hellenized it was. But because, for example, some Christians want to make the argument that it was very heavily Hellenized, therefore it's reasonable to believe that the traditional authors of the Gospels would be able to compose the Gospels in Greek. But obviously, if you are arguing that you are much more open to the countermove of saying that if the area was very largely Hellenized, there might have been Hellenistic influences on Christianity.
Yes.
For example, depicting for example, Jesus's birth is very similar to how births of other people who have divine parents, basically, or where the father is God, are depicted in Greek sources, right? And it's relatively dissimilar to previous Jewish literature. But I think Galilee was like a really rural area where there was basically nothing going on, right? Like there's no evidence of writing.
I think like, to give a bit more context here, though. Oh, you can go, Doug.
I just want to paraphrase the brilliant thing that Kamil just said. He basically said, look, you can't be a Christian and say, oh, yeah, these poor poor fishermen, they wrote the Gospels in Greek because, they were Hellenized, the Greek influence. That makes sense. And at the same time say, but no, there was no Greek influences that on certain narratives in the Gospels. They quarantine themselves off from all Hellenistic influences when they're writing the narrative, but they were influenced enough to actually read and write Greek.
Yeah, so sometimes it's really absurd, like when you point out the similarities between logos in Philo and logos in the Gospel of John. It's obviously very similar theological concepts. I've had Christians telling me that no, Philo, he got the logos from Plato. He lived in Alexandria, which was obviously like a very Hellenized city. So that's just coming from Timaeus and whatnot. But then the exact same thing, basically, in the Gospel of John. That's not a product of Hellenistic influence. That's in the Gospel because it's actually true.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Cam.
What was I going to say? Oh, so like in Galilee, there were places at the time of Jesus, like Tiberius, which was a city that was, from my recollection, built and named after Tiberius by the Herods. And that place was like very Hellenized and was set up as like a normal Greek city. And then like on the opposite side of Lake Tiberius, there were, and down to the south, like there were a bunch of like Greek cities as well. So I think that there are arguments to be made that some parts of Galilee at least had like Greek-speaking people and like Hellenistic influence. And one thing that to be aware is that like this whole region was like pretty frequented by travelers and stuff going from the more Hellenized Egypt and Alexandria and Cyrene and places like this, coming to other areas of the Mediterranean. So there was a lot of like, other ideas that were coming through this place at the time of the Gospels.
Okay, any more questions? We're going to wrap it up so Kamil can start his day. His birthday. 33 years old.
It was actually yesterday, but it's still 11th where your guy's at, right?
That's right. Oh, that interest. Talking about birthdays, we know, like you said earlier, we know the exact day of when Tiberius was born and died, but we don't know when Jesus was born or when he died.
We don't even know the year that Jesus was born. We actually get conflicting accounts.
Or died.
Some Christians would give you the exact date and year.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
We won't say who, bro.
If I was to leave the stream with anything, and I certainly know that it's incredibly unlikely Mike Lacona would be watching this, but I think it's the responsibility of these apologists to actually educate the people who follow them and respect them when they make mistakes in these areas. And I don't think it's sufficient to say, my bad, maybe my claim about Tiberius was wrong. You need to actually actively educate people who respect you, because the reality is that Doug, myself, and Kamil are not going to be able to affect enough people who are Christians who end up believing this stuff, because we just don't have that kind of reach in the Christian community. So my plea is, I know ridiculous as it sounds, please actually write articles on this stuff to correct these misunderstandings about our sources of history.
Well, did you like the way I kind of pushed this, Cam? I'm trying to appeal to the Christian sense of ego and trying to look cool. Like, don't you want to be a cool kid and show up your Christian friends and say, no, actually, that's not right. Let's get it right, guys. We're the bastions of truth here. Let's get this right.
Yeah, I always want Christians to make as good arguments as possible, because it's always frustrating when I read some book like of apologetics or something like that, and I just see something that's patently false, because it makes me anxious about what else am I reading that's not correct, and I'm just not able to tell, right?
The music has started, guys. You can't hear it, but the audience can. So that was roughly 2 hours and... No, it's under 2 hours. You guys want to keep going?
We are getting better at this.
Yeah, we only needed one comment saying keep your answers under 60 seconds.
Yeah, you guys were going a little too far there for a second. Raphael Block, Steelman, yes. My Open Mind, thanks for the British pounds. God's coming to earth as humans, Greek or other. God's coming to earth as humans, Greek or other. I'm gonna go with other. Who's that little child?
Yeah, I don't have a kitty, so I have to go with a child. These are the two things that get you a lot of views on YouTube.
Babies and puppies.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna poof you guys out one at a time. Poof. Poof.
The floating Doug.
Where did Doug find this terrible music? Ken, I found this music at a yard sale. Got it cheap. And as always, my apologies to Gary Habermas. He was scheduled to come on to defend the 1042 apologetic, but we ran out of time. Good to see you here, Mind Onion. Have a good night. Until next time.